Tonight, you drift into the quiet shadows of the Middle Ages, where myths whisper, candles flicker, and the line between legend and truth is softer than a feather pillow. Snow drifts lazily over a stone village square, the kind of snow that makes your eyelashes heavy and your boots slightly wetter than you'd prefer. You walk slowly past the crooked timber houses, their roofs slouched under centuries of weight, as though even the buildings themselves are tired of the cold. Chickens scratch half-heartedly in the frost, their beady eyes suspicious of you, because, well, chickens are always suspicious. Tonight's journey is not about glamorous kings or perfect knights. It's about stories you thought were bedtime nonsense, those half-whispered medieval myths that, against all odds, turned out to be surprisingly stubbornly true. Yes, the tales you rolled your eyes at might just deserve a second look. And before we go any further, a soft warning. You probably won't make it through this day. Sleep will likely arrive long before the last tale ends, and that's fine. It's what we're here for. So, if you haven't already, gently press that like button, subscribe if you'd like more of these slow wanderings, and maybe, if you're still awake enough, comment your location and the local time. I always find it a little magical to imagine someone listening in Mumbai at 3 a.m. while someone else drifts off in Chicago at 4 p.m. History, after all, is a shared blanket stretched across centuries. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You follow the cobblestones into a candlelit hall, where smoke curls lazily toward the beams. At a long table, parchment sprawls under the hands of monks, their quills scratching as though the world depends on ink and patience. One monk clears his throat dramatically, because monks knew how to add suspense when gossiping. He leans in and tells you the first myth, once dismissed as tavern chatter, that turned out to be real. Medieval people did believe in giant sea monsters, and not just vague creatures of imagination, but massive, writhing krakens that dragged ships down in seconds. For centuries, scholars assumed these were drunken sailor tales. But then, centuries later, washed-up squid the size of wagons confirmed that some monsters weren't just metaphor. They were swimming out there the whole time. The poor medieval sailor hugging a rosary at sea wasn't inventing nonsense. He was just slightly exaggerating a terrifying, very real squid encounter. And here's the obscure tidbit. In one 13th century manuscript, the kraken wasn't just described as a monster. It was said to smell like rotting fish so strongly that it lured other fish close, making it basically the world's most disgusting fisherman. Historians still debate whether the descriptions came from first-hand sightings or creative exaggerations, but the truth is clear. The line between myth and biology was blurrier than the fog rolling over the medieval docks. As you sit at the edge of the table, a monk pushes a cup of warm ale toward you, his eyes twinkling as if to say, "Told you so." The hall glows, the fire crackles, and outside, snow keeps falling soft, steady, relentless. The fire has burned low, embers glowing like sleepy eyes. You stretch, feeling the stiffness of the wooden bench beneath you, and wander into the corridor. The air smells faintly of wax and wet wool, that eternal perfume of medieval winters. Down the corridor, a tapestry flickers in the firelight, and you remember another myth, the tale that medieval people believed the earth was flat. You've probably heard this one repeated in school, how everyone thought you'd sail off the edge if you dared cross the ocean. It's a tidy story, isn't it? A bit too tidy. Because here's the quiet truth. Most educated people in the Middle Ages already knew the earth was round. Mariners navigated with curved horizons, astronomers tracked stars, and scholars pored over Aristotle's writings. The flat earth was mostly a later invention, a myth about a myth. Still, the taverns buzzed with other colorful legends. A peasant, chewing his bread crust thoughtfully, might insist that if you walked far enough, you'd meet people with faces in their chests or dog heads on their shoulders. It's comforting to know that humanity has always loved bizarre travel stories, even before the age of clickbait headlines. And here's your obscure tidbit. In some medieval maps called Mappa Mundi, cartographers actually drew those dog-headed men, the cynocephali, right at the edges of the world. These maps were less about accurate geography and more about moral storytelling. You weren't supposed to get there. You were supposed to learn something from the monstrous illustrations. Historians still debate whether medieval scholars genuinely believed in such beings or simply used them as allegories for those strange folks over there. Either way, the dog-headed people became popular enough to haunt manuscripts for centuries, wagging their ears across illuminated borders. You keep walking, your boots echoing softly. The corridor ends at a door, slightly ajar. Inside is a quiet library, parchment stacked like uneven bricks. You run your fingers over a spine, dust rising like ghosts. Someone left a candle burning here, and in its glow you notice a drawing inked carefully, a monstrous figure with sharp teeth and claws. Beside it, a note. Travelers say this one eats sheep whole. And you smile because suddenly you realize, even in an age of faith and fear, myth was how people made sense of the unknown. And sometimes they got it surprisingly, hilariously right. The candle flickers lower, and your eyes feel heavy, but the story doesn't end here. Somewhere down the corridor, more myths wait to be whispered, and you'll follow them, slowly, sleepily, deeper into the medieval night. The candle sputters, and you lean closer, watching melted wax trickle like tiny frozen rivers. Beyond the library door, the night deepens. You step outside into a courtyard where frost has painted every stone silver, and the silence is so complete you hear your own breath echo back at you. Somewhere a rooster coughs, yes, coughs, because apparently even roosters get tired of being roosters. Tonight's myth lingers in the air like smoke. The idea that medieval people drank beer all day because water was unsafe is half true, half fuzzy exaggeration. You see, water wasn't always dangerous, it depended on the source. But in many towns, water mingled with sewage and waste, which made ale the safer, more reliable drink. So yes, beer was common, even for children, though it was small ale, weaker than your modern light beer, basically liquid bread with a buzz so faint it could barely power a conversation. Here's the odd little tidbit. In some places, brewing was so widespread that households were legally required to hang a sign, a kind of ale stick, outside their door whenever a fresh batch was ready. Imagine walking through your neighborhood today and seeing a row of flags saying, "Fresh beer here." Uber Eats would cry in the corner. Historians still debate whether the everyone only drank beer trope was exaggerated later by moralizing writers. But the truth remains. Ale flowed through medieval daily life like water through a river. And just as rivers can drown you, ale could too, especially when brewed stronger for festivals or long journeys. You picture it. A line of villagers gathering at a cottage door, mugs in hand, faces flushed not from drunkenness but from cold. Their breath fogs the air, and their laughter rises, thin and brittle, against the night. Somewhere, a child sips from a wooden cup, grimacing at the bitter taste but too shy to complain. And you lean against the frosty stone wall, half amused, half impressed. Maybe, just maybe, you'd survive better here if you stuck with the ale, weak though it was. The stars above sparkle with quiet approval. The stars fade slowly as dawn creeps into the courtyard. You walk toward the gate, where a horse stamps its hooves impatiently, clouds of steam curling from its nostrils. Someone has saddled it with care, though the saddle looks more patched than leather. The rider waiting beside it nods, as though inviting you to journey further into the myths. This one you've heard before, that medieval knights really did bathe in armor, never removing their steel shells. It's an image so absurd you can almost hear the clanking in the bathwater. In truth, armor was expensive, custom-fitted, and most importantly, removable. Nobody wanted rusty joints, or worse, drowning in their own bath like a misguided tin kettle. But here's the twist. Knights did wear their armor for long, uncomfortable stretches, sometimes even sleeping in it during campaigns. Imagine trying to nap with a frying pan strapped to every limb. Now for the obscure delight. One medieval manual on knightly conduct warned against scratching your nose too often in armor, because it made you look undignified. Apparently, dignity outweighed comfort, even when your nose itched beneath a steel visor. Historians still debate whether chronic back pain and muscle strain were considered just part of the job for knights, or if they quietly complained more than the sources admit. One suspects there was much grumbling in private, and possibly some sarcastic comments muffled behind visors. You watch as the rider swings onto the horse and gestures toward the horizon. The road stretches out, muddy and frozen in patches, leading past fields rimmed with frost. Farmers bend over their tools, breath clouding, while children chase a wooden hoop down the lane. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes faintly, steady as a heartbeat. And as you walk beside the horse, your cloak wrapped tighter, you smile at the thought of a knight secretly longing to scratch his nose in public but deciding, with great dignity, to suffer in silence. The armor gleams in the morning light, but you can almost hear it groan. The road curves, and you follow it, step by step, deeper into truths hidden beneath myths, each one waiting for you like a candle in the dark. The road bends toward a cluster of cottages, roofs sagging under the weight of thatched straw and snow. Smoke curls lazily from crooked chimneys, the air thick with the smell of stewing onions, wood smoke, and the faint but undeniable odor of animals who live closer to their humans than modern zoning laws would approve. Here comes another myth, soft and stubborn, that medieval peasants lived their whole lives in filth, never bathing at all. You might picture a world of grime, layers of mud caked on every soul from birth to burial. But the truth is a bit more balanced. People did wash, though not with the convenience of hot showers or rose-scented soap. Washing might mean a wooden tub filled with water from the well, shared by family members in sequence, with the baby going last and the father claiming the first dip. And yes, sometimes clean meant simply rinsing your face, hands, and feet, which was considered a reasonable compromise. Here's your obscure little detail. Some medieval towns had stews, public bathhouses, where people gathered not just to wash but to socialize, snack, and occasionally get up to activities best left politely hinted at. For a while, the bathhouse was as common a meeting spot as the local tavern. Historians still debate how often the average peasant truly bathed. Was it weekly, monthly, or whenever your neighbor finally wrinkled their nose at you? What we know for sure is that medieval people liked to feel fresh when they could, even if fresh meant herbs rubbed into your clothing rather than a lavender bubble bath. You stand by the doorway of one such cottage, peering in. A woman wrings out a cloth by the fire, humming softly, while a child splashes happily in a half-barrel of lukewarm water. The air smells faintly of rosemary sprigs tossed into the bath to sweeten it. A man, sitting nearby, looks longingly at the barrel but knows his turn won't come until the water has cooled to the temperature of a swamp. And you? You smile, realizing that maybe dirty medieval peasants was just another myth blown out of proportion. After all, dirt is relative, and so is patience when you're waiting for your turn in the bath. By late afternoon, the air grows heavier, carrying the sharp bite of frost through every crack in your cloak. You wander past the fields, where oxen plod slowly, their breath fogging the sky, and farmers mutter softly to themselves as they turn the frozen soil. Beyond the fields, A low stone wall circles a monastery, and from within, chanting drifts like mist, calm, steady, eternal. Here lies the next myth, one with a surprisingly poetic twist, that medieval monks spent all their time in silent, solemn prayer. In truth, the cloister was not all hushed devotion. Monks prayed, yes, but they also brewed beer, tended bees, copied texts, gardened, and occasionally got into trouble. There were rules about silence, but rules bend as easily as a winter twig. Some monasteries even had talking benches, designated spots where speech was allowed, so gossip and conversation could bloom like weeds between psalms. Here's the obscure gem. In one 14th century order, monks developed a system of hand signs to communicate silently during meals. This meant you could ask politely for salt, bread, or even beer without ever breaking the vow of quiet. Medieval sign language at its most practical, and probably the origin of some very creative mid-dinner arguments. Historians still debate how strictly silence was enforced, or whether monks muttered more often than their abbots liked to admit. The surviving notes of reprimands, scribbled sternly by abbots in the margins, suggest monks were as human as anyone else. And humans, given enough stew and ale, always find a way to whisper. You step into the cloister, the cold air replaced by the warm smell of beeswax and bread. Monks shuffle past in robes patched at the elbows, their sandals worn, their faces serene but not humorless. One pauses to stir a pot of honey, another to scratch a note in the margin of a manuscript, a doodle of a rabbit playing a lute. Yes, even here, in the sacred halls, rabbits play lutes when boredom strikes the quill. And as the chant swells softly, you feel it. Myth and truth interlacing, not unlike voices in harmony. Silence, it turns out, is rarely absolute. You rest against a cool stone pillar, eyelids heavy, hearing the chant fade into the rhythm of your own breath, steady, slow, like a prayer of its own. The night has returned, velvet and deep, pressing gently against the cloister walls. You step back outside, where frost crackles underfoot and the moon spreads pale silver over the land. A dog howls somewhere in the distance because dogs, too, have always liked the sound of their own voices. Tonight's myth? The one about medieval people thinking tomatoes were poisonous. Well, that one's only partly medieval, it leaned more into the Renaissance. But the suspicion of strange foods did begin in earlier centuries. Foreign fruits and vegetables, with their odd shapes and unfamiliar tastes, often carried an aura of danger. Medieval diets were cautious and conservative. Bread, pottage, and ale were safe, dependable friends. A bright red fruit? Suspicious. Too beautiful to be trusted. Here's the obscure little tidbit. While tomatoes didn't make much of an appearance in the Middle Ages, parsley did. And in some corners of Europe, parsley was thought to belong to the devil. Planting it was believed to invite misfortune, unless you muttered protective prayers while scattering the seeds. So the herb you casually sprinkle on your pasta tonight once had an aura of doom. Historians still debate whether this fear was superstition spun out of nothing or a memory of some long-lost pagan association. Either way, poor parsley got a bad reputation until people decided soup was bland without it. You picture it. A peasant woman leaning on her wooden spoon, muttering half a prayer as she stirs a pot of cabbage and barley. The smell of smoke fills the room, smoke that seeps into your hair, your clothes, your soul, until you can't tell where the meal ends and the house begins. She sprinkles a pinch of parsley with exaggerated caution, glances at the rafters and sighs. And you? You sit by the fire, watching sparks float upward, thinking about how every age needs a scapegoat, even if it's a harmless green sprig. The stew bubbles, the room warms, and sleep tiptoes nearer. The stew is finished, bowls scraped, and the household drifts into rest. You step outside once more, into a village that now sleeps like a great huddled animal. The streets are quiet, the only sound the drip of melting snow from eaves, and the muffled snores of neighbors who definitely aren't shy about snoring. Your next myth strolls up like a cloaked figure in the dark. The belief that medieval castles were always damp, drafty, and impossible to live in. The image is strong in films. Dripping walls, cold stones, endless misery. And yes, castles could be drafty, but not all were unpleasant. Wealthy nobles hung heavy tapestries to keep the chill out, layered straw on the floors, and lit roaring fires in wide hearths. Some castles were surprisingly comfortable, especially for their standards. Here's the obscure gem. In one 15th century English castle, archaeologists found traces of wall paint in bright colors. Reds, greens, even gold. The grim gray we imagine was, in reality, often splashed with unexpected cheer. It seems our ancestors disliked monotone walls as much as modern renters do. Historians still debate how widespread these comforts were. Was every noble lounging in color-drenched rooms, or were some merely enduring stone drafts with a brave smile? The evidence is patchy, like the walls themselves. You walk into a great hall now, your footsteps echoing across flagstones. A fire blazes at the far end, the smoke trailing up into a vented roof. Tapestries ripple softly in the draft, their threads depicting saints, hunts, and, because some weavers had a sense of humor, strange hybrid creatures no one could name. Servants bustle quietly, laying rushes on the floor to freshen the air, scattering herbs to mask the less appealing sense of life. You settle into a carved chair, running your fingers along the armrest. It is smooth from centuries of hands, from lords and ladies, and probably from one or two cats who decided it made an excellent scratching post. Outside, the wind howls, but inside, warmth clings to the air. And you think, maybe castles weren't prisons of cold stone after all. Maybe they were homes, messy and alive just like yours. The hall grows quieter as the fire dwindles, shadows stretching long across the painted walls. You slip back into the corridor, boots crunching on straw scattered over the floor. A servant yawns, carrying a wooden bucket, and mutters something about the privy, which, conveniently, leads us into the next myth. You've probably heard it. That medieval people simply tossed chamber pots out of their windows with a carefree "look out below." The truth is, partly yes, partly more organized. In cities, waste disposal was indeed a challenge, and streets weren't exactly sparkling. But many towns had designated dumping spots, cesspits, or even early sewage channels. Not every resident wanted their neighbor's pot splashing on their doorstep. Here's the quirky tidbit. In Paris, regulations at one point required people to shout a warning before emptying their pots. Something like, "Garde-l'eau," a distortion of French for, "watch out for water." Imagine living in a place where bedtime was punctuated by strangers shouting "incoming" from second-story windows. Historians still debate just how common this practice really was. Was it constant, daily chaos, or more occasional nuisance? Surviving complaints suggest at least some poor souls were unlucky enough to be in the wrong alley at the wrong time. You picture it now. A narrow medieval street, dimly lit by torches, slick with rain and whatever else trickled downward. A man hurries through, clutching his cloak tightly. Overhead, a voice calls out the medieval equivalent of "duck." He hesitates, and that hesitation, as always, is fatal to clean laundry. You shake your head, amused, and step carefully down the corridor yourself. No chamber pots fly here, only the draft of night air sneaking through the shutters. And yet, somehow, you walk a little closer to the wall just in case. The corridor ends in a stairwell spiraling upward, the stones worn smooth by centuries of tired feet. You climb slowly, the sound of your breath mingling with the creak of old wood. At the top, a narrow doorway opens onto the castle's solar, the private chamber where lords and ladies retreated from the bustle of the hall. The myth waiting here is softer, more glamorous. That medieval ladies spent all day in towering cone hats with flowing veils, like illustrations in a child's fairy tale. The truth? Those extravagant hennins existed, but only briefly and mostly in wealthier courts. Daily headwear was simpler. Veils, wimples, and coifs that kept hair clean, modest, and manageable in drafty halls. The pointy hat was a fashion, not a universal reality. Here's your obscure gem. One noblewoman's wardrobe account from the 14th century included an entry for ear irons. Yes, tiny metal supports to keep her elaborate headdress standing just so. Imagine waking each day and strapping on scaffolding for your hair. Fashion hurts. Historians still debate how comfortable these headdresses were, or whether noble women privately rolled their eyes at the absurdity of balancing cones and veils. Some portraits suggest dignity, others a faint, weary tilt of the neck. You walk into the solar, where tapestries soften the walls and cushions pile near the hearth. A lady sits quietly, sewing gold thread into fabric, her veil pinned neatly, no cone in sight. A cat curls at her feet, purring with the authority of someone who knows it rules the household. The lady looks up briefly, meeting your eye with the kind of expression that says, "No, I do not wear that ridiculous hat while fetching bread." The firelight glows on her needle. The air smells of wool and lavender sachets, and for a moment, you feel the weight of daily life here. Less theatrical, more practical. The myths crumble softly, like dry rushes on the floor, leaving behind something warmer, more human. The solar fades behind you as you step out onto a balcony. The air is crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and sheep dung from the fields below. Stars scatter across the sky like salt spilled on black velvet. Somewhere in the distance, a night watchman coughs, his lantern swaying. This is where another myth stirs, that medieval people thought the world was flat. It's one of those enduring simplifications that sneaks into modern storytelling, but it doesn't quite hold. By the Middle Ages, educated Europeans, monks, scholars, navigators knew the earth was spherical. They inherited the idea from the ancient Greeks, and writings like those of Bede and Thomas Aquinas reinforced it. The myth survives partly because it's satisfying to imagine dark ages as wholly ignorant. But it just isn't true. Sailors knew the horizon curved. Astronomers charted stars as though the sky wrapped around a globe. The trouble wasn't whether the earth was round, but how big it was and what lay across the oceans. Here's your quirky tidbit. A 13th century manuscript shows a tiny illustration of a man literally walking off the edge of the earth. Scholars believe it was more playful than literal, a medieval doodle almost like a comic strip. Imagine a monk, bored of copying psalms, sneaking in a joke about gravity. Historians still debate how widespread the spherical knowledge was among common folk. Did a farmer tilling the fields have opinions about planetary geometry? Probably not. He was more worried about whether his ox would cooperate. You lean on the cold stone rail, the wind brushing your face, and wonder how you'd feel living then. Hearing travelers speak of a round world but never seeing proof. For you, the stars above whisper endless mysteries. For them, they were practical too, guides for planting, traveling, praying. The sky was both a map and a myth, wide enough to hold both truths. Descending the stair again, you find yourself in the kitchen. The smell of roasted meat, stale bread, and damp stone presses close. Fires still glow in the hearths, though most servants have retired. A few copper pots glimmer faintly in the embers' light. Here, let's address a myth you've probably seen in films. That medieval meals were endlessly spiced because the food was rotten. It makes for a dramatic image, but it isn't quite right. Yes, spices were abundant, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, but they weren't to mask decay. They were luxuries, status symbols, meant to show wealth and taste. If meat had spoiled, it wasn't eaten. It was dangerous, even for stomachs accustomed to rough diets. Instead, think of spices as medieval social media likes, a way to signal sophistication. A lord sprinkling cinnamon on his dish was the medieval equivalent of posting a vacation selfie with a cocktail by the beach. Here's your obscure gem. In some regions, powdered ginger was mixed with breadcrumbs and pressed into candies, served at feasts as both dessert and digestive aid. Imagine gnawing on what is basically a medieval gingerbread energy bar, centuries before anyone thought of protein snacks. Historians still debate the precise scale of spice consumption among the lower classes. While nobility flaunted saffron, the poor leaned on onions, garlic, and mustard seeds. The difference between dining in the hall above and eating in a cottage below was as stark as night and day. You sit for a moment by the dying fire, listening to the quiet clink of a servant cleaning dishes. The smell of ginger lingers faintly, warm and sharp. You picture the noble above, boasting of saffron threads, while the servant sneaks a crust of bread with onion spread. Both eat, both survive, but only one leaves a manuscript describing the feast. And so, the myth of spoiled food dissolves into the smoky air, leaving behind something richer, something more human. Hunger, taste, pride, and the little luxuries that made long winters bearable. The kitchen door creaks as you step back into the courtyard. The night has grown colder, and frost creeps across the flagstones in delicate, glittering veins. Your breath rises in little clouds, faint lanterns of your own making. Somewhere in the dark, a rooster crows far too early, as if confused about his shift. The myth that wanders toward you now is the one about bathing, or rather, not bathing. The story goes that medieval people never washed, that they feared water, that everyone stank perpetually. Like most myths, it holds a grain of truth sprinkled into a loaf of exaggeration. Bathing wasn't daily like in modern times, but public bathhouses existed in many towns, where people went not only to wash but to socialize. Hot water was poured into wooden tubs, herbs sometimes added, and steam turned the rooms into cozy, gossip-filled dens. By the late Middle Ages, though, concerns about disease and moralists frowning at bathhouse impropriety led to a decline. Here's the obscure tidbit. Some bathhouses offered menus. Not menus of food, menus of experiences. A bath with herbs cost more. A shared tub? Discounted. A private soak with music? Premium. Medieval wellness packages. Centuries before luxury spas put cucumbers on your eyes. Historians still debate just how often peasants bathed. Did they sponge off weekly at rivers, or only seasonally when weather allowed? Surviving records are uneven, like soap bubbles that popped before anyone wrote them down. You imagine yourself now in a dimly lit bathhouse, steam fogging the wooden walls, voices murmuring through the mist. Someone laughs too loudly. Someone sighs in relief as hot water soaks aching bones. Outside, frost bites at the windows, but in here, you're wrapped in warmth. The myth of total filth melts away, revealing a world where people craved cleanliness too, even if soap was made of ash and animal fat instead of lavender and lemon. From the bathhouse mist, you wander into the street. Cobblestones glisten, catching the moonlight like polished teeth. You pull your cloak tighter, the night air thick with chimney smoke and the faint, sour tang of ale spilled from the tavern earlier. This is the perfect place to greet the myth that medieval ale was safer than water. And yes, in some ways it was. Brewing required boiling, which killed off pathogens, making ale a safer bet than untreated river water. But it wasn't the whole picture. Wells, springs, and aqueducts also supplied drinkable water. People weren't constantly drunk from dawn to dusk, though some days, perhaps, they were closer than others. The funny thing? Ale wasn't always the strong stuff. Small ale contained very little alcohol, just enough to keep bacteria at bay. Children drank it, workers carried it, households brewed it in barrels the size of modern refrigerators. So when you hear that a medieval villager drank ale with breakfast, imagine something closer to weak iced tea than a party pint. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some monasteries, monks were allotted daily rations of beer, up to a gallon. Yes, a gallon. But remember, it was small beer low in alcohol. Picture rows of monks, each with his own frothy mug, chanting prayers in perfect harmony, with only mild tipsiness at vespers. Historians still debate how universal this practice was. Did every hamlet sip small ale as casually as water, or were some more dependent on springs? Records vary, as patchy as the brewing logs themselves. You stop at a tavern door now, light spilling through the cracks, laughter muffled within. For a moment you think about stepping inside. You can almost hear the clink of mugs, the chatter of gossip, the smell of yeast and wood smoke. The myth of endless drunkenness fades into something gentler, more practical. Hydration disguised as hospitality. The street is quiet behind you, the tavern noisy ahead, and you, as always, stand somewhere between myth and memory. The tavern's glow fades as you walk on, your boots tapping against cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of weary travelers. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, then decides it isn't worth the effort and curls back into silence. The night air settles heavier now, as though it too has secrets to keep. This brings us to the myth of medieval darkness itself, that once the sun set, the world plunged into total black, and people sat frozen in their cottages until dawn. It's a romantic thought, or perhaps a frightening one, depending on your imagination, but it isn't entirely true. People navigated nights with candles, rushlights, oil lamps, and, in larger towns, even curfews and night watchmen with lanterns. Obscure tidbit. In some towns, night watchmen didn't just patrol with lights, they sang. Their job was partly to remind citizens of the passing hours and partly to assure everyone that the watch was awake. Imagine trying to sleep with a man outside your window chanting, 10 o'clock and all's well, in a voice that sounds suspiciously off-key. Historians still debate how safe these medieval nights actually were. Were they truly riddled with danger, or simply perceived as more threatening because of the dark? Records of thefts and assaults exist, yes, but also of ordinary people traveling, working late, or even socializing by moonlight. You stand now in a square lit faintly by torches. A merchant carts in a barrel despite the hour. Two women whisper together, shawls wrapped tight. A night watchman trudges past, humming tunelessly. The myth of total silence and paralysis at night dissolves in the glow of small flames, replaced by something quieter but still alive. A community that didn't switch off, even when the sun did. As you leave the square, your path takes you past a row of crooked houses, their upper stories leaning so far they nearly touch. Wooden beams jut out like elbows. From behind one shuttered window, the faint scratch of a lute drifts into the night. Here comes the myth of medieval music, or, more precisely, the absence of it. Popular imagination paints peasants trudging through silent days, lives as dull as mud. Yet music was constant. In churches, at markets, in taverns, on street corners. Songs accompanied work, prayer, love, grief. Even lullabies drifted softly over cradles in cottages with dirt floors. Obscure tidbit. Some manuscripts preserve musical doodles known as rondel tales. A bored scribe, instead of stopping at the margin, would spiral notes into little tales shaped like dragons or vines. Imagine flipping through sacred music only to stumble upon a melody that literally curls into a doodle of a bird. Medieval marginalia, proof that even copyists got restless. Historians still debate how these songs actually sounded. Notation survives, yes, but tempo, pitch, and instruments are often left unmarked. Did peasants sing high and nasal, or low and droning? Did instruments sound more like rustic fiddles or refined viols? The truth lingers somewhere between, lost in voices long gone. You pause to listen at that shudder again. The lute's notes are uneven, probably an apprentice practicing, but there's a sweetness in it nonetheless. The sound threads through the cold night, making the crooked street feel less lonely. You hum along softly, almost without realizing it. And in that moment, the myth of a silent Middle Ages dissolves, leaving you with something warmer. A world always humming, sometimes clumsy, sometimes haunting, always human. The lute fades behind you as you wander toward the edge of town. The streets widen, the air grows colder, and the smell of hearth smoke thins into the scent of damp earth and hay. A barn looms ahead, its roof sagging like a tired man's shoulders. From within comes the faint lowing of cattle, soft and rhythmic. This is the perfect place to pause on a myth about animals, that medieval peasants slept in the same room as their livestock purely because they were uncivilized. The reality is, yes, animals often shared the same space, but it was practical, not primitive. Cows and goats gave off heat. Pigs rooted through scraps. Chickens offered a morning alarm clock before clocks were reliable. Survival made strange roommates. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some alpine regions, families built homes where the stable occupied the ground floor, and the family lived directly above, with warmth from the animals rising through the wooden planks. Imagine drifting to sleep with the steady warmth of a cow beneath you, like living above a giant, snoring radiator. Historians still debate how common this arrangement was. Did all peasants cozy up with their cows? Or was it more regional, shaped by harsh winters? Surviving architecture suggests both patterns existed, depending on climate and wealth. You lean against the barn door now, peering into the dim light of a single lantern. A child stirs on a straw bed, half asleep, murmuring at the sound of a sheep shifting in its pen. The line between domestic life and farm life blurs completely, not because of ignorance, but because every ounce of warmth and life mattered. The myth of filth fades into something humbler, an economy of survival, stitched from hay, wool, and the slow breath of animals at rest. The barn door closes softly behind you, and the fields open out under the stars. The horizon stretches wide, shadows of trees etched against the sky. You follow a rutted track, boots sinking into soft mud, until you come upon a small church, its wooden spire tilting ever so slightly to one side. This is where another myth whispers, the idea that medieval people were unshakably pious, that every waking thought was dominated by fear of hellfire. The truth is more layered. Faith was central, yes. Cathedrals loomed over towns, the calendar pulsed with saints' days, but belief mingled with superstition, humor, and practicality. Here's your obscure gem. In some regions, villagers blessed their bees. Yes, entire hives were sprinkled with holy water, because honey was precious and bees were thought to carry the soul of the household. Picture a priest solemnly chanting while bees buzzed indifferently, unimpressed by salvation. Historians still debate how deeply doctrine shaped everyday lives. Was every peasant trembling under visions of purgatory, or did most simply go through rituals as part of communal life? Sermons warn of hell, but court records also show plenty of brawls, jokes, and earthy humor. Faith was there, but it lived beside laughter, gossip, and ale. You step into the quiet church now, the smell of wax and damp wood thick in the air. A single candle flickers on the altar, and carved saints look down with the patience of stone. For a moment you feel the hush of devotion, but outside, you hear a burst of laughter. Someone stumbling home late from the tavern. Both truths coexist. Reverence and irreverence, piety and play, and the myth of a world paralyzed by fear dissolves gently, replaced with something far more human. People who prayed, but also lived, joked, and sometimes blessed their bees. Leaving the church behind, you follow the path toward the village green. The grass crunches faintly under your boots, glazed with frost that glitters silver in the moonlight. A wooden post stands crooked in the center, its shadow stretching long like a finger pointing nowhere in particular. This is the perfect place to unravel the myth that medieval justice was all torture and executions. The image is so common. Dungeons filled with chains, villagers lining up for grisly spectacles, but daily justice was usually far more mundane. Fines, shaming punishments, or public service were far more common than dramatic torture. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some towns had a punishment called the scold's bridle, an iron contraption fitted on the head of someone accused of gossiping or nagging. It sometimes included a small plate to press down on the tongue. Uncomfortable? Certainly. Fatal? Not usually. Imagine being humiliated for talking too much. Social media today would be one endless parade of bridles. Historians still debate how widespread severe torture truly was. Some argue it was rare, reserved for extraordinary crimes. Others suggest it was more routine in certain courts. Records are patchy, shaped by both law and legend. You linger by the post, imagining the occasional stocks set up here, villagers tossing rotten vegetables at some poor soul convicted of cheating on weights at the market. Not pleasant, but also not the endless bloodbath myth suggests. Most days, this green would see sheep grazing, children playing, and neighbors haggling, not constant grim ceremonies. The myth of universal brutality fades like mist, leaving a quieter, duller, more believable truth. Past the green, you wander into a small cluster of cottages. Their roofs slump under thatch, smoke curling lazily from holes cut crudely to vent the hearth. A faint glow leaks from one doorway, and you hear the murmur of voices within. A family gathered by the fire. This is where another myth flickers, that medieval peasants had no sense of comfort or coziness. The picture painted is often stark. Mud floors, smoke-filled huts, endless misery. And yes, life was harsh, but people carved out warmth where they could. Rushes and herbs were scattered on floors for freshness. Simple wooden benches were softened with cloth, and hearths served as both warmth and gathering place. Here's your obscure gem. In parts of England, families stuffed dried lavender or mint into bedding straw, both to mask odors and to ward off insects. A primitive potpourri, centuries before scented candles made the same promises. Historians still debate just how smoky and uncomfortable these cottages truly were. Some accounts describe unbearable conditions. Others hint at tidy, cared-for spaces. The truth likely varied with wealth, region, and season. You lean into the doorway now, watching a woman stir a pot of pottage while a child fiddles with a wooden toy carved from scrap. A dog snores in the corner. The air smells of herbs and smoke, sharp but comforting. Life here is hard, yes, but not without tenderness. The myth of absolute squalor softens, replaced with an image closer to truth. Survival laced with small comforts, carefully built into the fabric of daily life. The family doesn't notice you. They laugh softly at something the grandfather mutters. The fire pops, and for a moment you feel not like a visitor, but a neighbor, standing quietly at the threshold of a myth unraveling into human warmth. The cottage door closes gently behind you as you drift back into the chill night. Your path winds past a row of hedges, brittle with frost, and then into a small orchard where twisted apple trees stand bare, their branches clawing at the sky. An owl hoots once, then settles into silence. Here arrives the myth of medieval medicine, that it was nothing but superstition, leeches, and nonsense. The story goes that doctors waved herbs at you while muttering Latin, and recovery was more luck than skill. While some treatments were indeed rooted in humors and astrology, there was also a surprising amount of practicality, herbal remedies, wound care, even surgery that worked on occasion. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval surgeons sometimes used honey on wounds, not as a sweet garnish, but because honey has antibacterial properties. Modern science backs this up. Picture a grizzled barber surgeon smearing honey over a cut with the same nonchalance as you might spread it on toast. Historians still debate how effective overall medieval medicine was. Accounts of recoveries exist, but so do tales of catastrophic failures. Survival often depended on the illness, the skill of the practitioner, and sheer chance. You pause under a tree, touching the rough bark, and imagine a villager in this very orchard, gathering herbs, sage for digestion, thyme for coughs, mint for a headache. Medicine wasn't always learned in dusty halls, but in gardens and fields, whispered from mother to daughter. The myth of total ignorance softens into something more familiar. Trial, error, and the search for relief, one leaf at a time. Beyond the orchard, you find a mill by the river. Its wheel creaks, turning slowly in the moonlight, water splashing softly against its paddles. The building hums with quiet power, even at this late hour. Here spins another myth, that medieval people were stagnant, their world unchanged for centuries until the Renaissance woke them from their long nap. But mills like this prove otherwise. Watermills and windmills multiplied across Europe, grinding grain, pressing olives, sawing wood, even powering early machinery. The Middle Ages weren't static. They pulsed with invention, often quietly, practically, without fanfare. Here's your obscure gem. Some monasteries used watermills not just for grain but for fulling cloth, that is, beating wool with wooden hammers powered by water. Imagine walking past a stream and hearing the relentless thud, thud, thud of cloth being pounded, like a medieval drumbeat keeping time with progress. Historians still debate how widespread such innovations were, or how evenly technology spread across regions. Some villages clung to hand tools while others hummed with mills and gears. You stand by the river, listening to the steady churn of the wheel, and realize how alive this world truly was. Not frozen, not waiting for some grand awakening, but moving forward in small, practical steps. The myth of a dark age stagnation crumbles with each splash of the water wheel, leaving behind the steady truth of human ingenuity turning, always turning. The wheel creaks on, slow and patient, like time itself grinding away, and you, still walking, follow its rhythm deeper into the night. The river path carries you past the mill and into a stretch of open meadow, pale in the moonlight. The grass is stiff with frost, and in the distance, you hear the faint jangle of a bell on some wandering sheep. The air is sharp enough to sting your nose, but clean, crisp, and oddly invigorating. Here comes the myth of medieval childhood, or rather, the claim that it didn't exist. Some argue children were treated as miniature adults, working as soon as they could walk, without innocence or play. The truth is more nuanced. Yes, children worked early, but there is evidence of toys, lullabies, and games, too. Childhood may have been shorter, but it wasn't entirely absent. Here's your obscure tidbit. Archaeologists have found tiny clay animals, carved wooden knights, and even little dice in medieval digs, proof that children played. Imagine a peasant boy rolling dice by firelight, while his mother sighs, warning him not to lose the family's only carved lamb figurine. Historians still debate just how much affection children received. Were they cherished tenderly, or treated with cool practicality given high mortality rates? Surviving letters show both. Doting parents mourning losses, and brisk accounts that sound almost detached. You picture it now. A child darting through this meadow by day, chasing a hoop made of bent willow, laughter ringing across the fields. Tonight, the meadow is silent, but the echoes remain. The myth of childhood as non-existent softens, replaced by something bittersweet, a briefer, harsher, but still very real stage of life. The meadow narrows into a lane lined with crooked hedgerows. Your boots crunch on the frozen dirt as you approach a small inn, its sign swaying in the cold wind. Faint light seeps through shutter cracks, and you catch the muffled hum of voices within. This is the perfect stage for the myth of travel, that medieval people never left their villages, living and dying within a few miles. The truth? Travel was more common than we think. Pilgrims trekking to shrines, merchants roaming trade routes, soldiers marching with banners, minstrels wandering from town to town. Villagers might not cross oceans, but they often moved further than the myth allows. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some inns provided not just beds, but entertainment, including trained animals. Records mention a monkey in London that drew paying crowds. Picture weary travelers sipping ale while a monkey in a little tunic performs tricks by the fire. A medieval roadside cabaret. Historians still debate how much travel touched the lives of ordinary peasants. Some lived tethered to fields. Others joined seasonal work, fairs, or pilgrimages. Movement varied widely, a patchwork of possibilities stitched across the map. You slip inside the inn now. The air is thick with smoke, the scent of stew, the warmth of bodies pressed close. A minstrel strums a lute near the hearth. A merchant boasts of far-off markets. A tired pilgrim snores on a bench. The myth of immobility dissolves in the laughter and chatter. The world may have been smaller, but feet still wandered, stories still spread, and strangers still met over mugs of ale. You sit for a moment by the fire, letting the hum of voices lull you, as if history itself were cradling you in the crook of its elbow. The inn fades behind you, replaced by a long, narrow bridge arching over a sluggish river. The water glints darkly, disturbed now and then by the ripple of some unseen fish. The night sky reflects faintly, but clouds drift, breaking the shimmer. Here comes the myth of the filthy Middle Ages. You've heard it before. People never bathed, everyone stank, and hygiene was a lost cause. While its true sanitation was primitive, the myth is exaggerated. Bathhouses existed, and personal grooming mattered more than the caricature suggests. People washed faces, hands, and feet, and linen undergarments absorbed sweat, changed more often than outer clothes. Obscure tidbit for you. Some medieval bathhouses doubled as social hubs, with music, meals, and even scented oils. They were so popular that moralists sometimes condemned them for being too fun, because clearly hot water and a little lavender oil were gateways to sin. Historians still debate how widespread bathing was, especially after plague outbreaks made communal baths suspicious. Did people wash less out of fear, or did they simply adapt, turning more to dry cleaning methods like rubbing with cloth or powders? The evidence shifts like the river below. You picture a traveler crossing this very bridge centuries ago, clutching a small bar of imported soap like treasure, knowing that a warm bath awaited in the next town, if they could afford it. Tonight, though, the air smells only of wet earth and faint wood smoke. The myth of filth softens into something else. A patchy, uneven reality, far more human than the cartoon of dirt and stench. On the far side of the bridge, the path slopes upward, winding between ancient oaks whose bare branches twist like skeletal hands. The wind sighs through them, carrying whispers, almost voices. It's the perfect setting for the myth of witch burnings, a story tangled in fear, exaggeration, and memory. Many believe the Middle Ages were soaked in flames, with witches endlessly hunted. The truth is subtler, the height of witch trials came later in the early modern period, not the Middle Ages. Here, accusations existed, yes, but mass burnings were less common. Obscure tidbit. Some accused witches defended themselves with remarkable creativity. One woman insisted her nightly flights were not with demons but with her own vivid dreams, essentially arguing for an overactive imagination instead of sorcery. Medieval courts weren't always convinced, but you have to admire the attempt. Historians still debate how much medieval belief in witches was real fear, political manipulation, or just ordinary quarrels dressed in supernatural language. Was the neighbor really casting curses, or just borrowing your sheep without asking? Hard to say. As you walk under the groaning branches, you can almost feel the weight of those old fears, the rustle of suspicion, the shadows where accusation grew. Yet here, centuries later, the silence of the woods makes the myth feel faint, almost like smoke dispersed on the wind. The trees stand, the path remains, and the stories linger, stripped of their terror, softened into echoes. You pull your cloak tighter, amused by the thought that if you vanished into these woods, someone might well have blamed a witch. A convenient excuse, better than admitting you simply wandered off in search of warmer company. The oaks thin, and you find yourself on a road that widens into a clearing. At its center stands a crooked wayside shrine, candles guttering in glass. The wax melts slowly, casting halos of trembling light. Here is the myth of medieval medicine, or rather, the grim caricature that doctors did nothing but bleed patients and mumble prayers. While bloodletting was common, it wasn't the only method. Herbal remedies, poultices, and even surprisingly practical surgical techniques existed. Monastic infirmaries often combined prayer with diet regulation and herbal treatment. Obscure tidbit. In the 13th century, surgeons used wine as an antiseptic to clean wounds. It wasn't modern sterilization, but it worked better than water. So yes, a splash of claret wasn't just for toasting. Sometimes it was for disinfecting. Historians still debate how effective medieval treatments truly were. Were they primitive guesswork, or surprisingly efficient within their framework of humors and balance? The truth may sit uneasily in between. Standing by the shrine, you picture a weary villager pressing a sprig of rosemary into your palm. Whispering it will keep the chills away. You can almost smell the pungent green scent. Whether science or superstition, the act itself holds comfort. Medicine, after all, is not only cure but care. The myth of endless barbarity in medicine loosens here, replaced by the quiet image of candlelight on herbs, a monk grinding dried plants with steady hands, and someone finding just enough relief to carry on another day. Past the shrine, the path leads to a ridge where the land spreads wide beneath you. A village lies below, roofs silvered by moonlight, smoke rising from a few stubborn chimneys. The air is sharp, but your breath comes softer here. This is the stage for the myth of relics, those holy bones, feathers, or splinters of wood that drew crowds. Skeptics mocked them as scams, and certainly many were. Yet their role was powerful. Relics drew pilgrims, shaped trade routes, and funded cathedrals. People believed not just in the object, but in the journey, the act of devotion itself. Obscure tidbit. One relic, supposedly the feather of the Archangel Gabriel, was displayed in Palermo. When scholars later examined it, they found it was most likely from a goose. Imagine traveling hundreds of miles only to kneel reverently before poultry. Historians still debate how much relics were believed literally versus symbolically. Did pilgrims truly think they were touching St. Peter's finger? Or was it more about the sense of connection? Sources leave the answer shimmering, unresolved. From the ridge, you imagine pilgrims trudging toward that village, their candles bobbing in the night like stars brought down to earth. Some may have believed fully, others half-doubted, but all carried hope in their packs. The myth of relics as foolish trinkets falls away in the moonlight. What remains is the quiet understanding that objects carry power when we let them. Whether a bone, a feather, or even the stone you pick up on this very ridge and turn idly in your hand, feeling its cool weight. The road winds into a shallow valley, where a castle rises against the horizon. Its towers glow faintly in moonlight, windows no more than pinpricks of gold. You hear the creak of the drawbridge, though no guard stirs. The air smells faintly of iron and damp stone. Here comes the myth of the knight in shining armor, noble and chivalric, rescuing maidens and defending honor. The reality? Knights were often brutal, self-interested landowners who fought as much for wealth and feuds as for ideals. Chivalry was less a code of everyday behavior and more an aspirational marketing campaign. Obscure tidbit. Some knights actually refused to fight unless they were paid enough ransom insurance, essentially medieval hazard pay. Heroism, but with an invoice. Historians still debate how much chivalry shaped real conduct versus literature. Did knights truly live by it? Or did troubadours and poets simply polish their image? The answer remains wrapped in conflicting accounts. You pass beneath the looming gate, stones cold under your hand. You can almost see the great hall beyond. Tables stained with ale, men bickering over land, a minstrel strumming a verse about valor that no one quite believes. The myth of the perfect knight clinks hollowly here, softer than steel, faded like a banner left too long in the wind. The castle path curves around to the courtyard, where torches sputter and shadows stretch long. The wind hums through the battlements, carrying the faint clang of a distant bell. Here waits the myth of impregnable castles. Tall, stone, eternal, aren't they invincible? Not quite. Castles fell with surprising frequency, undone by siege engines, fire, or betrayal from within. Their might was real but not absolute. Obscure tidbit. During one siege in the 13th century, attackers catapulted beehives over the walls. Imagine defenders scrambling not only from arrows but also from furious swarms of bees, nature's sting as a weapon. Historians still debate whether castles were primarily military fortresses or symbols of lordly dominance. Their walls certainly kept out enemies, but they also reminded peasants who held power. The dual role blurs in records and ruins alike. As you walk the courtyard, the stones beneath your feet seem to sigh with memory. A garrison once paced here, cold and hungry. Families huddled behind these walls, hoping they'd hold. And perhaps they did, until one day they didn't. The myth of the eternal fortress dissolves under the weight of history's slow crumble. Even the strongest stone is temporary. Even towers fall. But tonight, in the hush of torchlight, they stand just long enough for you to imagine yourself inside, safe, before the wind tugs you back toward the road. You approach a stone building tucked among trees, its door creaking as you push it open. Inside, the scent of parchment, beeswax, and a faint tang of dust. Candles gutter along long wooden desks. Shelves groan under manuscripts bound in leather. A scribe bends low over his work, quill scratching patiently. Here is the myth that the Middle Ages were an age of ignorance, where no one read, wrote, or thought. It is a caricature born of later centuries. In truth, monasteries, universities, and courts preserved and expanded knowledge, often in painstaking detail. Algebra, astronomy, theology, law all found their ink here. Obscure tidbit. Medieval scribes sometimes doodled in margins. Cats were frequent culprits, too. Paw prints appear in manuscripts where an unlucky feline stepped on wet ink. Imagine centuries of learning interrupted by an annoyed meow and an inky mess. Historians still debate how widespread literacy was outside clerical or elite circles. Was reading reserved for monks and nobles, or did merchants and artisans pick up more than we think? Records are uneven, leaving room for argument. You stand quietly in the library, running your hand over spines of vellum, feeling the grooves and ridges. The myth of ignorance seems thin here, eclipsed by the whisper of quills, the hum of study. Not everyone could read, true, but for those who did, the world expanded one careful stroke at a time. Past the library lies a cloistered courtyard, moonlight slanting across arches. You hear the soft shuffle of sandals, the faint rustle of robes. A monk carries a lantern, pausing to adjust it, light spilling across the stone. This is the ground of the myth that medieval people believed the earth was flat. It is one of the most persistent falsehoods, repeated endlessly. But the truth? Most educated people knew the earth was round, a fact inherited from ancient Greece and widely taught in medieval universities. Obscure tidbit. A 9th century Irish monk casually sketched a globe in his notes. To him, roundness was obvious, hardly worth debating. He likely would have chuckled at later centuries for accusing his age of flat earth thinking. Historians still debate how much common folk knew about cosmology. Did villagers imagine a flat world because it looked flat, or did they simply not dwell on it at all? Silence in sources leaves this uncertain. You walk the courtyard slowly, footsteps echoing. Overhead, the night sky curves in a dome of stars, brilliant and infinite. You feel the roundness of the world beneath your feet, steady and sure, centuries removed from false myths. The myth of the flat earth falls apart under the simple weight of observation. The monks who gazed up at the heavens saw what you see. A world vast, curving, and mysterious. They may not have known everything, but they weren't blind to the obvious. You breathe in the cold air, lantern light flickering against cloister walls, as if truth itself were a soft flame, steadying your step through the shadows. The fields stretch wide, ridged and furrowed, hard with frozen soil. You catch the faint silhouette of a plow abandoned at the edge, its wood black against the silver grass. The myth that comes here is the one of medieval peasants as mindless drudges, laboring without joy, knowledge, or rest. The truth is both harsher and kinder. Work was grueling, yes, tied to the rhythm of the land, but there were also festivals, holy days, and games. Peasants were not just bent backs in the mud. They sang, feasted, and sometimes outwitted their lords in small, clever ways. Obscure tidbit. Medieval villagers played a game called mob football, where whole towns chased a ball through streets and fields, with barely any rules. It was part sport, part chaos, part excuse to skip work. Imagine the plow abandoned because everyone's sprinting after a pig's bladder. Historians still debate how much freedom peasants truly had. Were they trapped by obligations, or did they carve out surprising autonomy within the cracks? The records flicker, caught between tax rolls and festival songs. You walk past the plow and picture a man setting it down with relief, joining neighbors at the tavern for ale and laughter. The myth of joyless drudgery softens in the dark, replaced by the image of tired but spirited lives, stitched together by both hardship and small rebellions. The road bends toward a village square, silent now under the moon. At its center stands a weathered wooden post, once used for announcements, punishments, and market notices. The myth here is that medieval justice was only brutal stocks, executions, and cruelty without thought. Reality complicates the tale. Yes, punishments could be harsh, but much of justice was local, communal, and surprisingly restorative. Fines, oaths, and reconciliations played as big a role as blood and spectacle. Obscure tidbit. In some towns, minor offenders were sentenced to carry a large stone through the streets as penance. Heavy, yes, but also temporary, a public reminder rather than a lifelong scar. Think of it as medieval community service, only rockier. Historians still debate how consistent justice was. Did peasants trust the system, or fear it as arbitrary? Was fairness more often the goal, or simply power disguised as law? The records whisper both, leaving no neat answer. You pause by the post, hand brushing its rough grain. You can almost hear the echo of voices. A crier reading finds aloud, villagers gossiping, a boy balancing on tiptoe to touch the post just to say he dared. The myth of merciless justice loosens here, reshaped into something uneven but human. Sometimes harsh, sometimes merciful, always tangled with the needs of a small community trying, clumsily, to keep itself together. The square falls silent again, as though it too has fallen asleep, the wood and stone weary of judgments long past. You step through the chapel door, the wood groaning softly. Inside, the space glimmers with candle stubs and the faint sheen of painted saints on cracked walls. The myth waiting here is that medieval faith was monolithic, unquestioned, and absolute, that everyone believed the same without doubt. But the truth is layered. Belief was strong, yes, but doubt and debate hummed beneath it. Theologians argued over doctrine. Villagers mixed Christianity with older folk practices. Skepticism peeked out in satire and jokes whispered over ale. Obscure tidbit. One manuscript records a prayer against toothache that invoked both saints and the names of strange, half-forgotten spirits. A little holy, a little pagan, all desperate. Historians still debate how deeply personal faith was versus how much it was communal ritual. Did villagers feel the sacred in their bones, or simply go through motions? The evidence is patchy, torn between sermons and stories. You sit in a pew, listening to the silence. You can almost hear an old voice rising in chant, echoing off stone, filling the small space. The myth of uniform belief dissolves into something more human. Faith as both anchor and improvisation, woven of certainty and doubt, hope and habit. Leaving the chapel, you find yourself on a lane that narrows into fields again. The night feels heavier here, the shadows darker, as though something unseen stirs. This is the ground for the myth of constant, overwhelming fear, the idea that medieval life was soaked in terror of devils, omens, and apocalypse. The truth? Fear existed, yes, but it mingled with humor, resilience, and a strange familiarity. Devils danced in mystery plays not just to frighten but to amuse. Omens were read, but often shrugged off when daily work pressed. Obscure tidbit. In one French village, people celebrated donkey masses, where a donkey was led into church, braying responses in place of the congregation. It was part mockery, part festivity, part reminder not to take fear too seriously. Historians still debate whether apocalyptic anxiety truly dominated, or whether it flared in specific crises, plague years, famine, or war. The baseline mood may have been less panic, more weary endurance. You pause by the lane, the silence pressing. For a moment, you imagine shapes in the dark, then laugh softly, because you also remember the donkey. Fear and humor side by side. The myth of a life consumed by terror loosens here, replaced by something subtler. A balance of dread and jest, shadow and song. The wind sighs through the hedges, and you feel the world exhale with you, carrying both its fears and its laughter into the night. You crest a low hill and see a manor below, its timber beams stark against pale stone. Light flickers through high windows. Somewhere a dog barks, and then the sound dies into silence. Here is the myth of endless medieval poverty, that everyone was poor, ragged, and half-starved. The truth? Inequality was sharp, but wealth existed in many layers. Nobles dined richly, merchants thrived, artisans crafted luxuries. Even some peasants, through luck or wit, built modest prosperity. Obscure tidbit. Inventories from well-off households list cushions stuffed with feathers, dyed fabrics, and even board games. A far cry from straw pallets and empty bowls. Historians still debate how wide the middle strata reached. Were they rare exceptions, or was medieval society less polarized than we think? The answer shifts with every new ledger uncovered. Standing outside the manor gates, you picture a feast inside. Roasted meat, honey cakes, a harp playing softly. Beyond, fields where laborers gnaw coarse bread. The myth of universal poverty cracks open, revealing a patchwork world. Some hungrier, some heavier with feast, all bound by the same fragile thread of survival. Past the manor, the road leads toward a city wall rising out of the mist. Towers pierce the sky, and gates stand closed for the night. You imagine the bustle inside. Merchants tallying coins, craftsmen hammering late, nobles debating politics by candlelight. This is the ground for the myth of absolute kings, rulers who held unchallenged power, bending all beneath their crowns. The truth is less tidy. Kings argued with nobles, parliaments, and even towns. Power ebbed and flowed, often limited by custom, rebellion, or the church. Obscure tidbit. One king of France had to cancel a law because townspeople literally banged pots and pans in protest outside his residence. Apparently, royal decrees could be undone by enough cookware. Historians still debate how much authority kings truly wielded over daily life. Were they central forces, or distant figures barely noticed by villagers? Evidence sways between chronicles praising power and records of resistance. You pause at the city gate, palm on the cold stone. The myth of absolute monarchy dissolves under your touch. Kings were mighty, yes, but not gods. They were part of the same fragile balance. Sometimes obeyed, sometimes ignored, sometimes mocked with pots and pans until they yielded. The torches on the wall flicker, their flames trembling in the wind, as if even crowns must bend to the weather. You follow the road along the river, its surface catching the first pale hints of dawn. A boat drifts slowly, oars dipping with steady rhythm. The myth here is of medieval stagnation, that nothing changed for centuries, that people lived the same dull lives from start to finish. The truth? Change was constant, if uneven. New plows, windmills, cathedrals, trade routes, languages shifting, stories reshaped. The Middle Ages were not a frozen age, but a restless one. Obscure tidbit. In the 14th century, glasses were invented, spectacles, perched on the nose, helping scholars read longer into the night. Imagine the sudden gift of clarity, words sharp again for aging eyes. Historians still debate how rapid that change truly felt. Was it sweeping and visible, or subtle and unnoticed, like the slow bending of a tree in the wind? The records give glimpses, but no steady answer. You watch the boat vanish downstream, ripples folding into the current. The myth of stillness ebbs away. The river itself is proof, always moving, never the same twice. The road finally opens into a wide meadow, grass silvered by frost. The first light of dawn brushes the horizon, faint gold bleeding into deep blue. The myths that trailed you all night settle quietly, like birds folding their wings. This is the ground for the last myth, that the Middle Ages were only darkness, a void between classical glory and modern brilliance. The truth is gentler. They were human centuries, flawed and bright, harsh and joyful, filled with ordinary lives stitched together by myth and memory. Obscure tidbit. Even in the so-called Dark Ages, people brewed beer flavored with herbs, sang bawdy songs, and carved little faces into church pews, mischief smuggled into piety. Historians still debate what the Middle Ages mean. Are they a cautionary tale, a foundation, a mystery? Or perhaps they are only themselves, no more, no less. You sit in the meadow watching the light grow. The night of myths unravels softly around you, and history rests, no longer needing defense or correction. It simply breathes. And now, as the horizon stretches wide, let your thoughts stretch too. Slower, looser, uncoiling like threads unwound. You've walked the long road of the night, past myths of knights and witches, castles and plows, saints and jesters, and you've seen them soften, blur, and fade. They no longer stand rigid. They drift like mist, gentler than before. The meadow is quiet, wrapped in the cool breath of early morning. Each blade of grass holds a pearl of frost, shining faintly, trembling, but steady in the growing light. You feel the air fill your lungs. Cold, yes, but calm. A hush that smooths the edges of thought. The myths you carried all night settle into the earth around you, like stones pressed into soft soil, no longer heavy, just part of the ground. The torchlight, the candlelight, the murmurs of libraries and inns, the whispers of fear and laughter, they all fold away into silence. Only the rhythm of your own breath remains, slow and steady, like the oars of the boat you watched on the river. Every sound thins to stillness now, the rustle of grass, the sigh of wind, the faint hum of memory. You are safe in the meadow, wrapped in its quiet, and the dawn rises not to wake you, but to let you rest deeper. The myths fade, the night fades, the world itself grows soft and blurred at the edges. Your eyes grow heavy, your body sinks. The meadow holds you like a cradle. History is quiet now, the road is still, and there is nothing left to chase. Just let go. Breathe slowly. Rest fully. Drift gently into sleep.